Thick, gooey, chocolatey is naturally what comes to mind when you think of espresso from conical burrs, right? Not the case with these 83 beasts. I like to call them gentle giants, and I'm sure you're curious why. Let's get into it. This behemoth is the Aries by a Taiwanese company called Mixcool. It's their first ever grinder and they've decided to go straight to the big leagues. Risky move. Yep, it's pretty expensive, but we'll get to that. I first saw this grinder at Expo in Portland and I found it really interesting for two reasons. One, obviously the massive 83 cone burrs that aren't made by Matzo, and the other, the workflow. Now, playing with this grinder has been a real trip and I'm super excited to share my experience with all of you. Now, before we get started, this grinder was sent to us by Mixcool. No money exchange hands, they've had no say in what we've put in this video and they don't get to watch it before any of you do. A big thanks to Blue Tokai Coffee Roasters here in India for sending us a bunch of great coffee to test this grinder out. Check them out, the link is in the description below. And lastly, thank you to Benki Brewing Tools for helping with all of the logistics. If you're looking to buy some coffee gear, then use the link in the description below to get 5% off. Okay, so this review took a lot longer than it should have because the unit sent to us was struggling to grind even dark roasts at the highest RPM. So we had to send it back. After running a bunch of tests, Mixcool found an issue with the collar burr. So they changed the burrs and sent us back the same grinder, which is what we'll be reviewing today. Okay, there's no denying that this grinder has serious presence. Put it on a counter and it'll get your attention. I think it's really cool, and while it has this jacked look, the footprint is quite conservative. I mean, I think it kind of looks like a mod bar on steroids. Now, most of the popular grinders today are sort of built on geometric forms, and is why I felt like the niche was a breath of fresh air when it first came out. Much more organic, with these rounded features, really made it stand out from the crowd, and I feel like the Aries is similar in that respect. The main body is this organic lofted form that gives it these unique characteristics. While the niche falls more in the cute category, the Aries gives me superhero villain vibes, and I dig it. This, combined with different materials, finishes, and textures, make it a pretty sexy beast in my opinion. Oh, and if you have a Flare 58, they both have this bent over cantilevered form and they play really well together visually. But what about in the cup? I'll get to that, but first, we need to talk about the build quality. The Aries is made using a combination of zinc alloy, ABS, and polycarbonate and weighs around 8 to 9 kilos, which is substantial. Most of the key touch points like the catch cup, the burr carrier, and the grind adjustment all feel really solid. This is good because you will be tempted to destroy the catch cup in a fit of rage every now and then. I'll explain why in a minute, but luckily it's indestructible. The base is also fully metal, making it nice and stable, but the entire body section of the Aries is plastic. Now personally, I'd have liked to see more metal here given the price point, but at least it feels solid with no real flex when pressure is applied to it. Now this unit was manhandled with care by DHL and actually arrived with the threading stripped off 2 of the 4 screws that secure the base onto the body. While you probably wouldn't be playing catch with this grinder, this incident kind of exposed the weak spot. You have this heavy cantilevered top section being held in place by 4 fairly small screws that are threaded into plastic. Now, in Mixcool's defense, this particular unit was taken apart multiple times to test that stalling issue that I mentioned, and that most certainly weakened the threading. A brand new factory unit would not have suffered the same damage, but I still think there's room for improvement around this area of the design, especially if they're looking to market it for commercial use. Now, while I'm willing to look past the plastic on the body, I just can't seem to do the same with the hopper. This definitely feels cheaper and akin to something you'd find on an entry-level grinder like the Baratza Onko or the Wilfers Fart. This is only the hopper, by the way. The lid is fine. I mean, the gauge of the plastic is decent. It doesn't feel flimsy necessarily, but the finish just isn't quite there. Just take your finger and run it along the edge of the anti-popcorning disc, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Speaking of popcorning, I think we can move on to looking at the UX. But yeah, overall, the build quality is pretty good. I just think the hopper could use a little more refinement. Alright, coming to the UX, let's grind some coffee, talk workflow, sing some praises, and hold back some profanities. I'll also save the best for last. To use this grinder, just flip the switch at the back, drop the beans in, and press the knob to start grinding. The grounds that come out of the Aries are nice and fluffy. I'm also happy to report that this thing now chews through the lightest of roasts without skipping a beat, and the 200 watt brushless DC motor makes it very quiet. It has next to no retention because the grind path is very short and has no chute, so pretty much everything you put in, you get out. Unlike your NFT investments. Just be sure to use RDT for the best results. That refreshing spritz of water giving the naive beans a brief moment of joy, even hope maybe, before they're sent away to be pulverized, oblivious to the fact that this act of kindness was to prevent their guts from being sprayed all over the place Tarantino style. Sorry, I've been wanting to do that one for a while now. Okay, for the really stubborn grounds, use the knocker and this nifty lid bellow hack for a full purge. It also has an auto-off function that honestly works really well. As for the grind path, you drop the beans into the hopper and this rubber fin then rotates and sweeps the beans into 2 feeding holes through which they're dropped into the burr chamber. Popcorning isn't terrible, but I feel like it could be improved if the anti-popcorning disc had more of an overhang instead of being roughly the same radius as the cutout below. Now, one really interesting thing about this grinder is that the inner cone burr is fixed while the outer collar burr rotates. This has allowed them to have the super short open bottom grind path while also eliminating the need for a central shaft. So in theory, and the keywords being in theory, this should allow for better alignment and less play when grinding. But who knows? The grind size adjustment is quite nice. It is stepped but feels stepless because the button disengages the clicks and allows you to move the dial freely. Once you're at the desired setting, releasing the button then locks it in that position. You get 2 clicks per division and each click, I'm told, moves the burrs by 25 microns. Yes, if you've been brewing espresso for a while, you may notice that this number is quite high. For context, most espresso grinders are either stepless like the Sculptor S and DF grinders, or they have very small steps like the Weber Key and J-Max. In comparison, the Key has a 5 micron movement per step, which gives you very fine control over your grind size, and this is clutch for espresso. With the Aries, I like that I can very quickly go from espresso to French press and back, but I do wish I had a tad more granularity on the espresso side. Okay, I love magnets and I really enjoy the largely mess-free workflow with the catch cup being attached directly to the exit of the grind path, similar to the Weber Key. Now, if you recall, I mentioned that you may have the urge to destroy this catch cup from time to time. Now, while this thing is well built, it's very annoying for 2 reasons. Number 1, the lip on this bell is just too shallow and it tips over way too easily. I'm already clumsy, so it isn't surprising that I've made a big mess more than a few times. It just makes an otherwise enjoyable experience quite stressful. Number 2, this texture on the inside is really baffling. I mean, it's as smooth as an elephant's bottom. It makes no sense because the grounds struggle to slide out and the fines build up over time. To me, it almost looks unfinished. Luckily, both of these issues can be very easily fixed, and I really hope McSchool sorts them out. I also wish it came with a lid, like the Weber one does, so you can actually shake this blind shaker. The base is nice and heavy, and I like the unique design, but the grounds do build up in these openings and is a bit of a faff to clean. The next one may seem small, but I absolutely love the detachable cable. The Sculptors are the first grinders that I've used that have this, and for someone like me who's constantly moving stuff around, it makes life so much easier. I think every electrical appliance should have detachable cables. Anyway, let's talk RPM for a second. Now, we're seeing more and more manufacturers adding the RPM feature to grinders, and the Aries is no exception. Here, you have 5 fixed settings that go from 90 to 150, and the impact they have on the cup is really interesting, and we'll talk about that in the next segment. One thing I noticed is that you can't change RPM while the grinder is running, so no RPM profiling here. I'm not sure why they designed it this way though. Now, I've said this before, that the research on the impact of RPM on particle size distribution and eventually in the cup is still in its nascency, so while this is not an essential feature, it's definitely nice to have. Okay. I said I'd save the best for last, and you probably guessed it by now, but check this out. This is hands down the easiest grinder to open up and clean that I've ever used or come across, and that includes hand grinders too. I mean, it literally takes a second. Insane. If you know of one that's easier, then let me know in the comments below. And here's a quick tip. This carrier can be fitted in 4 different positions, and some are a little better than others, at least in our testing. For example, we got less bitterness and more balanced shots with the knocker in this position. The assumption here is that the alignment changes ever so slightly with each of these orientations, so tinker and find your sweet spot, or just leave it alone and enjoy the grinder. I must say, I've really enjoyed using this grinder, and the workflow is great for the most part. But now, on to the most important question, how does the coffee taste? Since this is an espresso first grinder, in my opinion at least, I'll start with that. So you must be thinking, if the traditional cone burr profile is thick and gooey and chocolatey, then the bigger the burrs, the thicker and gooier the shots? Not the case here. Like I said in the beginning of the video, I like to call these gentle giants, and they're pretty special. If I had to distill it down to one word why you should be interested in these burrs, then it would be mouthfeel. They somehow make the shots fluffy and airy like a meringue. There's this silky smooth creaminess, almost like textured milk was blended in. I've not really experienced this before, and I must say I really like it. All I can say is, prepare for your tongue to be seduced. What's even cooler is that it's no slouch in the clarity department. I mean, it's no ZP6, but overall the Aries manages to elevate the cone burr experience and offer something more refined and sophisticated. Oh, you also get a happy ending. The finish is very enjoyable. Put a good coffee through this and it just lingers on your palate for a long, long time. By the way, if you're into milk-based drinks, then just remember to lower the milk ratio when using this grinder. The shots are really smooth, so if you wanted to cut through and actually enjoy the nuance that these burrs bring to the table, then I highly recommend cutting back on the amount of milk you add to your drinks. And maybe we can appease the vegan gods just a little bit. Okay, I mentioned earlier that RPM does very interesting things on this grinder. I mean, we sort of know that conical burrs tend to produce less fines at lower RPMs, which means shot times should come down as you go slower, right? Nope. The opposite happened here. The only guess I can make is that lowering the RPM on this grinder also reduces the grind size. But the other surprising thing was, in most cases, both Namisha and I prefer the higher RPM shots. The slower ones seemed to pull more astringency and bitterness out and were generally more boring. The higher RPM shots, on the other hand, were smooth, balanced, and noticeably sweeter. I found this fascinating, and if any of you own this grinder and have tinkered with RPM, I'd be super curious to know if your experience was similar, because I am now way more confused and way more intrigued by RPM. I've barely scratched the surface of the possible permutations and combinations of RPM and espresso recipes, and definitely plan to head down that rabbit hole. We tend to share these sort of post-review tests on Instagram, so be sure to follow us there if you're interested. Oh, and if you enjoy our content, then a like and sub would be super helpful. Okay, so from what I've seen, the Aries is marketed as an all-round grinder and does really well at immersion style brewing like the AeroPress. The pour-overs I've brewed have also been very enjoyable with decent clarity and none of that harshness that you usually get from more espresso-focused cone burrs, especially in the finish. And the mouthfeel has been really enjoyable across the board. But anywho, to summarize, I have really enjoyed the Aries because it's allowed me to experience coffees, even ones that I'm very familiar with, in a new and unique way. But is that enough to justify the price tag? Okay, I think it's time we address the elephant in the room. This is not a cheap grinder, and at $1,200 to $1,400 you're right at the lower end of the premium grinder market with the likes of the Lagom P64. People willing to drop this kind of cash on a grinder have pretty high expectations, but we've seen far more expensive grinders than the Aries that have had issues. Alignment issues with the Weber key, stalling with the EG1 at lower RPMs, the Lagom P100's absurd ground knocker, and various other issues that we've seen. So I'm going to approach this segment keeping all of these things in mind. While I did dock some points on build quality and a few minor workflow quirks, the Aries is still one of the cheapest ways to experience large cone burrs, and the ones in here are pretty great in my opinion. To my palate, these burrs bring something new and unique to the cup, but whether this profile is for you or not is a question you need to answer. But the people that I think who'd really enjoy this grinder would be 1, someone who already owns a high-end flat burr grinder and is looking for something really different. And number 2, if you're someone who generally gravitates towards a more traditional cone burr profile but you're looking for a more refined and elevated experience in the cup, then the Aries will not disappoint. So yeah, as debutants in the space, I think McSchool have done really well. While the Aries may not always feel like a $1,200 grinder, I definitely think it looks and grinds like one. And on that bombshell, I think it's time we wrap this one up. But now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this grinder. Would you buy it? Do you have any other questions? And is there something that we missed? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and brew ARAMSE.